Hi, my name's Joe Cernik. I'm a member of the faculty here at Lindenwood University, and I'd like to welcome you to Insight. Now, Insight is a show where we normally discuss books on politics, both domestically and internationally. Sometimes we talk about historical books that provide some perspective or insight onto the present, or broader atmospheric or trend analysis books that give you some sense of developments to be aware of. Today we are talking about a book addressing international affairs. It's written by a man named Charles Kurzman, and the book is titled The Missing Martyrs: Why Are There So Few Muslim Terrorists? Now, joining me on the show today are three Lindenwood University students. To my immediate right is Baley Bauer. To Baley's right is Alexis Stanley. And to Alexa's right is Lukas Walker. So I wanted to read an opening quote from the book and then have the members of the panel jump in and give their opinions so that we can start to get a sense of how the book is giving you some insight into this issue. The author writes, "We don't see more terrorism. If every car is a potential weapon, why aren't there more automotive attacks? Car bombs have been around since the 1920s. Drive-by murder takes very little skill at all. People have been killing people with cars ever since the automobile was invented, yet very few people resort to this accessible form of terrorism. In addition to cars, plenty of other terrorist weapons are readily available. One manual for Islamic terrorists, published online in 2006, listed 14 simple tools that are easy to use and available for anyone who wants to fight the occupying enemy, including setting fire to homes or rooms at sleep time. Acts of terrorism have not led Muslims to revolt."
The assumption around the world is that Muslims all are terrorists, but as the book illustrates, that is not as common as we seem that it is.
Yeah, I think the author did a really good job of putting it into perspective of that the stats are actually way lower than what we think, because the media definitely makes it more known.
Yeah, I would agree with Alexa. One thing Kurzman really hit on was that the media kind of over-glorifies terrorist attack. They take the few incidents around the world and just really over-popularize them, over-centralize them, and
yeah, I mean, a sense of perspective is certainly what he's saying is missing, is that, and it's understandable, you see something where suddenly there's an explosion, or we see in Europe where people are taking trucks, for example, and ramming them through a crowd. And then you're sitting there and thinking, well, okay, you're going to get a lot of attention. We're going to constantly talk about it. But it's very difficult, I think, from a TV point of view, to put something in a broader perspective and say, how many acts of terrorism are there actually, and why aren't we seeing just constant daily waves of terror attacks?
I believe, as the book states, though, the more that the media puts it into the public's eye, we're playing into their hand. They're broadcasting it across the world, and that's exactly what the terrorists are wanting us to do. They want the word to be known.
I agree with that, because, for instance, they said how Osama bin Laden was almost obsessed with the media, and that's how he did his recruitment. And I think, obviously, the media wouldn't be doing their job if they didn't cover it, but that's what they want. So,
actually, kind of surprising, what I found in this book was that terrorism numbers have dropped almost exponentially after 9/11. Since the United States is over in the Middle East actually fighting the terrorists now, I think that they've had a harder time recruiting people to actually fight back against the United States now that they have a presence there, and as opposed to just acting out different, terror plots.
Yeah, he had started by talking about somebody who tried to do a terrorist act at his own university, University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. And he was talking about this kid, a Muslim, who drove a car through a crowd, and he injured a few people but didn't kill any. And they tracked him down, and realizing that he had been at a shooting range. and he liked shooting a Glock, and he could have bought a rifle, so he could have used the rifle to kill a lot of people, but he didn't want to buy a rifle, and he didn't want to fill out the paperwork, and he had his heart set on a Glock as a pistol, so that the author was trying to show here's sort of an odd way that you're looking at, you're thinking, well, if the object is to kill lots of people, you could have done so with a distance rifle, but he doesn't want that. He wants this sort of Glock that he definitely wants to use only that weapon, and he only wants to drive his car around, but he doesn't do a real good job of doing it. And so it was sort of his opening to start to raise the issue of, how come we're not seeing massive quantities of death out there?
What I found interesting about that story was that he didn't want it to be too big because he wanted to stay alive. He wanted people to know who he was and why he did what he did in this at that college.
I also found it interesting how he wasn't recruited. Just his hatred for the U.S. government and seeing it in the media was enough for him to do that. So I think that was very interesting.
Yeah, also about him was he really didn't understand the organization and religion he was fighting for. And he expresses that in letters he wrote from prison afterwards. He often contradicted himself, saying that he liked Western music, which radical jihadists, normally denounce. So I think that he kind of just got way too influenced way too quickly, didn't do the research, and just kind of fell into Osama bin Laden's trap.
Yeah, the author calls them incompetent and bewildered, and so sort of an interesting way of sitting down and referring and saying, here there were all these sites he could have picked for using a car to attack people, and he picks the most worst site possible in which for him to hurt people. He had to way he had to maneuver the car was all wrong. He saw other things he could have done, and so you're sitting there and wondering, gee, he just seemed to be so incredibly bad at what he was doing.
Yeah, it's interesting in the author he talks about the killing in context, about how Islamist terrorists only kill about 50 people per day. And when you look at the other statistics, about 1,500 people die each day from civilian violence alone, and also from 500 from warfare and 2,000 from suicide. So to look at the numbers in comparison to how other deaths occur, it's not as large as what the media projects.
I think another problem that they have is that they don't train them anymore as well. Training numbers in terrorist camps have dropped also exponentially since 9/11. And they've had a hard time recruiting people to go to those camps, so essentially terrorists just aren't as well trained and well versed anymore.
Well, yeah, he goes through the difficulty of getting to a terrorist camp, that where they're located. It isn't going to make it very accessible. And we're talking about a group of American Muslims that tried to get to camps, and they got so frustrated that some of them turned around and came home, and they were subsequently arrested. And the one that finally gets through, he gets killed. And so you're looking at the idea of the logistics of, okay, you got to somehow pack your bag, go to a terrorist camp, and trying to figure how are you precisely doing it. They were running out of money trying to figure out all the points of entry to get there. And so they were trying all types of ways. And so he went into great detailed discussion about it's not as easy as it looks.
Yeah, they were saying that 250 is the biggest camp that they have right now, and they're trying to keep it small so that it's not detected and easily taken down by outside forces like the United States.
There's a nice quote he has I like. He says, "The world's most notorious Islamic terrorists have denounced their fellow Muslims for their passivity." And so he goes, each day the sheep in the flock hope that the wolves will stop killing them, but their prayers go unanswered. And so this is sort of a criticism by Al-Qaeda that people have not risen up to join them as you begin to have some of these acts of terror.
Yeah, one of the leaders actually compared people that don't commit to violence as scum, that a flood would wash away. The people that don't commit to violence are essentially that scum. They don't really do a whole lot, and they just kind of go with the flow, go with the tide of people that really don't commit to violence. They see another way to achieve the ends that the people that actually do commit terrorism see.
Here's a quote I like. He says, "Today's Muslims do not deserve to be called Muslims." This was insisting one of a past terrorist, "because they have veered from the principles of Islam. Only a revolution that establishes Islamic government will entitle Muslims to call themselves believers."
Yeah, I had that quote as well, and also one of the leaders of Al-Qaeda actually said, "You're not human if you fail to join us, if you stand behind the battle." So,
and I think, again, this is what you're getting a sense of as you're reading this book, that it's not sort of like, why aren't we seeing just enormous numbers of these people, but we're not.
Yeah, they say that it's amazed that the community of Islam is still asleep while children are being wiped out. And they say that Islam is supposed to be the faith of unity and cooperation, as it wants to assist the Muslims, whether they're oppressors or oppressed, but we're just not seeing that as the media is projecting.
Yeah, he's saying maybe you have around 100,000 terrorists, maybe, but he's saying a number of them subsequently dropped out and went home because they became disgruntled because they weren't being trained properly. I guess that's what the way he wants to point it. And he says, but if you think about it, you have more than 1 billion Muslims, so you have a very small percentage that are actually actively involved in terrorist activity. And so again, he's saying very difficult to just go out and recruit.
Yeah, as stated in the book, well over 99% ignored the call to action, and most effective tend to be territorially based movements. And then, as stated, after 9/11, fewer than 1 in 15,000 Muslims were being recruited.
I think the media kind of failed bin Laden at one point because they kind of took away his credibility when he just went into hiding, and instead of like actually coming up in front of people and talking, he just hid behind a camera.
I feel like they're having trouble recruiting, obviously, but like they just have, like, they want attention, and the media is giving them that, and if someone agrees with it, they'll just go with it.
Here's this quote here. He's saying there's this impression that there's sleeper cells all over the place, and it says Fox News has made a name for itself by repeatedly trumpeting alarming information, such as a growing body of evidence pointing to the presence of suspected members of terrorist sleeper cells operating on U.S. soil, and secret reports that Mexican drug cartels are teaming up with Muslim gangs to fund sleeper cells right here in the U.S. and abroad. And he says none of these allegations have borne out by any judicial investigation. And so Fox News sort of knowing how to talk to its audience, but in a way that's of questionable accuracy.
Yeah, I've heard that there were some sleeper cells in Missouri actually a few years ago, and of course none of those panned out. It was just kind of a fear tactic, kind of a fear-mongering tactic to get, maybe some more support for the war that continued over there. Other than that, I don't really know why they would even waste their time with it.
I found it very interesting that bin Laden granted interviews, that he wanted the media to come and see him. And in one of the quotes that I liked the most, he said, "Internet is a blessed medium that benefits us greatly by making it possible for people to distribute and follow the news," saying that they're allowing them to defend their agenda, their ideas, and their goals, and to promote terrorism just through the media and every day that everybody sees.
Yeah, like Al-Qaeda officials said that bin Laden was actually obsessed with media attention because he knew that was the best way to recruit, and that's why he did grant those international interviews.
Yeah, one of the terrorists was very critical of bin Laden's media strategy. He says he caught the disease of screens, flashbulbs, fans, and applause. And so that wasn't saying something kind about bin Laden. It was more a criticism of what he was doing. And so what you end up doing, again, is, that why are they doing that? Well, because they're not doing a very good job at recruitment.
Mm-hmm. Right. In the recruiting, they don't the terrorists, they're supposed to live normal lives until they are summoned into the terrorist organization using traditional clothes. They have to have prepared documents with them at all times for when they are summoned. They cannot do anything illegal. Even something as simple as running a red light is seen as a legal act, and this will make them less likely to be summoned into the terrorist groups.
The student at University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, drove this car. It was interesting that in prison, and this is very big in the Muslim world, to know the difference between Sunni and Shia Islam, different approaches to the religion. And he didn't know the difference. He didn't know that he was considered a non-Muslim because he's Shiite, not Sunni. And so, again, you're looking at some sort of incoherent connection about how he's sort of wanting to commit this terrorist act.
Yeah, it's interesting that he knew nothing about the Islamist ideology, but he was willing to put his entire life on the line for this cause.
Yeah, the fact that they also said in his letters he actually misspelled Al-Qaeda. And the fact that his hatred for the U.S. government and just seeing it on the media drove him to do that and was not recruited initially is mind-blowing.
He says, the bad news for Americans is this: Islamic terrorists really are out to get us. They can't be deterred by prison sentences, enhanced interrogation, or the prospect of death. They consider the United States to be their mortal enemy, and they would like to kill as many Americans as possible in as dramatic a way as possible. The more I look at their websites, watch their videos, and read their manifestos and discussion boards, the more I realize that these are a brutal and inhumane bunch. It is worth taking them seriously. The good news for Americans is this: there aren't very many Islamic terrorists, and most of them are incompetent. They fight each other as much as they try to fight us, and they're constantly looking for state sponsorship.
Yeah, I think that was really exemplified by the student at Chapel Hill, the incompetence of most terrorists. However, the ones that are out to get us really do hate us. I've read in multiple books by soldiers that have fought overseas that the hate that these people over there just possess is just incredible. You can see it just by the way they act when they see Americans, in their eyes, the way they talk to us. But I don't think that really we should be too worried about them, because there isn't a very big majority that actually would be able to carry out like a detailed, thought-out, big terrorist plot like 9/11, especially now that the U.S. has passed things like the Patriot Act, the TSA, taking those steps to prevent it even farther.
Yeah, the threat today is not bad. The bad news for America is the future or potential threat. If they do become more sophisticated, like in 9/11, the big plan was to hit the East and the West Coast, was to hit America on all sides. And if they had the numbers, it would have been a very bad time for America.
It's interesting. They're citing how in Muslim countries there's a certain percentage of people that support the idea of suicide bombing as a form of violence against civilians to justify their cause. And what he says, and if you ask Americans the same types of questions, the percentages are about the same. It's okay for the United States to kill civilians if it justifies their cause. And so he was just trying to show how in some ways there isn't sort of this extreme difference. There's some, in some cases, a similarity. I thought the section he did on what was called radical chic, where people like to talk about how they're sympathetic for bin Laden or Al-Qaeda, and they're saying they see him as a hero or an anti-hero or whatever terminology you want. But he says a lot of that is symbolism and not much more, that they're not really jumping on board to do things.
Yeah, in that chapter, I found it very mind-blowing that a lot of people outside the United States were kind of happy and in a troubling sort of pleasure that we got hit. they are saying in a couple quotes that we believe to be more powerful and we don't care about anything outside of our borders. So they saw it as a hit to our ego, that our ego was being taken down. And one of the quotes was, "We are sorry for Americans, but we're not sorry for America."
The other thing that was interesting, he was going through all types of sections that when terrorists actually do a terrorist act in Middle Eastern countries, that the support for that organization declines. And so he was saying we were still in the early stages of doing a lot of good public opinion polling to understand how Muslims are looking at themselves and their reaction to violence. But that what is becoming apparent is that once you see a terrorist act in a Muslim country, the chances are there's going to be a decline in support for that organization.
One of the best quotes or paragraphs that was said in that book to support what your statement was, "We must make this battle very violent, such that death is a heartbeat away, so that the two groups will realize that entering this battle will frequently lead to death. That will be a powerful motive for the individual to choose to fight in the ranks of the people of truth in order to die well, which is better than dying for falsehood and losing both this world and the next." But what was interesting is that this is actually backfired, that more terrorists that target Muslims, the less popular the terrorists become. The
other quotes I liked, there's one in here, they were talking with sort of the man in the street interviews in Muslim, and they were asking people how they looked at bin Laden, and one guy is saying he saw him as larger than life, and he said, "I'm not saying that he's supernatural, but his character is somewhat supernatural. A human being can't be like this." And so the idea was that they can't quite believe he was able to carry out the attack on 9/11, and that somehow or other it was only possible without some broader entity able to help him. So they're seeing it in sort of an unreal way to some extent, and that as a result it's somewhat removed from the idea of let's just talk about the logistics of how this was carried out.
Yeah. That actually started like a lot of conspiracy theories, basically almost saying that our government assisted them or helped them and or they just didn't put in action to stop it. So that was one of the theories that came out of that.
Yeah, I think that how we described him as larger than life really kind of puts in perspective why most Muslims don't join the terrorist organizations. They don't really support the people that carry out these terrorist acts. They just kind of agree with the ideology behind it and not actually the means of like carrying it out.
There's this organization which is called the Taglahai, and he's talking about how basically they are almost like Al-Qaeda in how they believe everything and how they're going to have their members dress and act and behave and absolutely everything like it. But he says that Taglahai leaders do not believe in violence or revolutionary activity. So the idea of sort of assuming here's this organization that has the same thinking process of how they see the world around them and their relationship to, let's say, the West or the United States. But from that, we don't necessarily see this movement of people go out and commit violence.
Yeah, they state that they're preparing the minds of thousands of its participants, and it takes time and money, but also their lives in the cause of Islam. But their leaders are rarely even involved in politics. So.
Yeah, and they've been denounced by radical Islamists because they are wasting lots of time training their minds to be peaceful, as opposed to training them for war and to fight for their cause.
And I thought there was a nice section in the sense that Americans, some of them want to believe there was a big conspiracy behind 9/11 and it was being carried out by some element within the United States, and so they developed this whole very complex way of looking. And it's interesting that Al-Qaeda members are really pissed off at that because then it's taking credit away from them for having done it. So it's sort of an interesting little feature of how you see that. Now, we only have a few minutes left, so let's go, how do you look at the book? Do you recommend viewers read it? What do you think about it?
I think it shines a light on terrorism around the world, and it gives Americans maybe a peace of mind that terrorism is not at our back door. We're not going to be taken down tomorrow, that their numbers are not as big as that they may seem.
I think this book was really interesting to me. It put it in a different perspective because, watching the news, the media, I thought it was like this big ordeal, but when you put it into numbers, it's actually not. But I also think he didn't diminish what we need to look for in terrorism. So I think he did a very good combination of the two.
Yeah, I would recommend this book. It gave me really good insight on how terrorists think, what they're willing to do, the extreme factions, what the factions that are more peaceful, I didn't even know those existed. But I think that it was a very good book and that he did a good job authoring it.
Yeah, it's not just completely, let's say, him doing research. He was out in the field because he talks about going to specific countries and interviewing people, and then he was showing the difficulty of trying to actually meet some terrorists. So there was like a real paranoia and suspicion and incredible guard. And so he's saying if he's having all this difficulty of trying to sit down and try to have some contact with terrorists so he can interview them, that how difficult it is for people that sort of say, oh, I want to be recruited and I'm trying to find out how to find the place, and it's not that easy. And so again, you get this feeling that this is a very difficult thing to do, to suddenly say, yeah, I'm going to join, which is why maybe these few that become inspired within the United States and sort of feel they have some connection, but in the process of the connection, they really aren't sort of becoming associated. They're just sort of in their head having some sort of an affiliation, and that he's saying that's what you tend to see a lot. So he doesn't sort of feel like this thing is really going to continue to grow, and I don't see that.
In his conclusion, he leaves us with a couple steps of what we should do after we read this book, and I took them into perspective. He says that turn down the volume on terrorism debates, put the threat of Islamist terrorism in perspective, but also give credit to the Muslims as the primary defense against Islamist revolutionaries, and also accept uncertainty because we will never know what their capabilities are, but also to be brave and don't abandon your values.
And so I think we all agree it's a good book to read. It isn't a very long book, so you can get through it, and I don't think you need necessarily a background in the study of terrorism to be able to read it. So from that point of view, I think it's quite readable, and audience members would probably enjoy it. Okay, so thank you for joining us today.